On the south, Wellington had entered France by Navarre. His numerous army, consisting of English, Spaniards, and Portuguese, had forced the passage of the Bidassoa and occupied Saint-Jean-de-Luz. But for the space of a month, our army kept him stationary before the lines of Nivelle. On the 9th of November, Wellington at length forced the French to fall back on the entrenched camp of Bayonne. In this second position, our troops again kept the Allies in check for the space of a month. However, on the 9th of December, the enemy effected the passage of the Nive. But after 4 days of fighting, and notwithstanding the desertion of the German troops, who on the 11th of December went over in a mass from our camp to the Spanish lines, Wellington was compelled to halt at the foot of the glacis of Bayonne. Thus, French courage, aided by the talent of Marshal Soult, opposed to the invaders on the banks of the Adour, a barrier more formidable than the Pyrenees. The Duke d'Albufera was the only one of our marshals whom adversity had not yet assailed. He halted on the Llobregat in Catalonia, astonished to see Spain assume a triumphant attitude and unable to prevail on himself to retreat before an enemy whom he had always been accustomed to subdue. His headquarters were at Barcelona. With regard to Italy, Rome still continued to be the second city of the French Empire. The Austrians had not succeeded in forcing the passage of the Adige. Prince Eugene was at Verona with 80,000 French and Italian troops opposed to the Austrian army of General Bellegarde. Our reserves were concentrating in Alessandrino. In general, the people of northern Italy were well disposed towards us. It was obvious that if the King of Naples should join Prince Eugene, Italy would not only be saved, but an imposing diversion would once more be made upon Vienna from the summits of the Julian Alps. But in Italy, the intrigues and seductions of the enemy appeared to threaten us with greater danger than we had to apprehend from his forces. Insinuations were made to Prince Eugene, but they did not succeed in shaking his fidelity. Similar attacks were directed at the vanity of the King of Naples. The troops whose assistance he had promised us were about to arrive at Bologna. Napoleon and Prince Eugene could not believe that this was the advance of a new enemy. 200,000 French troops were thus dispersed, 50,000 on the Elbe, and 100,000 at the foot of the Pyrenees, and 50,000 on the other side of the Alps. If they could not concur in the principal action, they might at least make useful diversions on the Elbe. Our troops impeded the advance of Bennigsen, the Russian reserves, the Swedish forces, the Prussian corps of Tauenstein and Dobschutz, and all the Landsturm militia of Hesse and Hanover. In Holland, our garrisons engaged the attention of the English, who were anxious to establish the House of Orange in a more effectual way. Our armies on the Pyrenees prevented 200,000 Spaniards, English, and Portuguese from entering and pillaging our southern departments, and Prince Eugene had obliged 80,000 Austrians to halt on the Adige. Our armies at remote points remained in our alliance auxiliaries, who it was well known would turn against us the moment we should quit the fortresses in which they were shut up along with our troops. Besides, the negotiations were maintained only for the purpose of settling restitutions, concessions, and exchanges. Perhaps what we yet reserved of the possession of Europe might be deducted from the sacrifices which we were required to make to obtain peace. To evacuate the fortresses of the Elbe had now become impossible. For the space of 2 months, all communication with those garrisons had been cut off. Perhaps there was yet time to hazard the determination of evacuating Italy, abandoning the fortresses of the Rhine, and concentrating all our forces upon Paris. But Napoleon was fearful that the troops might be endangered in their retreat, that they might not arrive until after the event, and that uncertain military calculations might lead to the sacrifice of advantages which were daily becoming more and more valuable. He therefore contented himself with demanding divisions of infantry and cavalry from Marshal Soult and Prince Eugene. In the second month of the campaign, it was expected that these reinforcements would successively enter the line. For the sake of securing these resources, Napoleon unreservedly sacrificed the claims which, during 4 years, had involved him in disputes with the Pope and Prince Ferdinand of Spain. By thus smoothing down the hostilities of the south of Europe, he conceived he could, with more safety, diminish the amount of his forces in Italy and the Pyrenees. The Pope was accordingly no longer detained in Fontainebleau. He received permission to return to Italy and set out to take possession of his episcopal chair at Rome. With regard to Prince Ferdinand, at the commencement of December, the Count de la Forêt had waited upon him with communications from Napoleon. On the 11th of December, a treaty was signed by which Ferdinand was to be permitted to return to Spain on 3 conditions. First, that he should punctually pay the pension of the king his father. Second, that he should deliver up the French prisoners, a step that would have ensured to Spain the restitution of hers, which were 20 times more numerous than the French. Third, that when free from the yoke of France, he should not place himself under the yoke of England. Ferdinand eagerly signed these conditions, and after writing with his own hand a letter of thanks to Napoleon, he set out for Catalonia. Marshal Suchet escorted him as far as the Spanish advanced posts, and on the 6th of January he arrived at Madrid. However tardy might be the steps thus taken for smoothing the troubles of the Church and the resentment of the Spaniards, they might be expected to produce at least 2 important advantages. The return of the Pope to Rome was likely to preserve the north of Italy from becoming the prey of the Austrians, and the restoration of Ferdinand was calculated to put a period to the influence of Wellington at Madrid. While Napoleon exerted himself day and night to raise an army, to prepare his reserves, and to diminish the number of his enemies, he no less eagerly pursued every remaining chance of bringing affairs to an amicable conclusion. Amidst such an accumulation of adverse circumstances, the safest course was to advise peace, but the grand difficulty was to obtain it. The negotiations, which had been suspended throughout the whole of December, seemed about to be revived at the commencement of January. Lord Castlereagh, the English Minister for Foreign Affairs, had quitted London to join the ministers from the cabinets of the other Allied powers. He landed at The Hague on the 6th of January and immediately proceeded to the headquarters of the Allies. Napoleon, on his part, had sent the Duke de Vicenza on a mission to the sovereigns, but our minister, who had been detained at the enemy's advanced post since the 6th of January, was anxiously awaiting the passports which he had solicited from Monsieur de Metternich. We have now arrived at the commencement of the last negotiation and the last campaign. The situation of France became daily more and more critical. The Allies, when they determined on invading France, had calculated that their immense superiority of numbers would sufficiently enable them to encounter the wrecks of our armies. But from the fury with which the peasantry of Alsace and the Vosges opposed the advance of their detachments in every village, they began to fear the dangers of a general rising in France. They therefore endeavored to conciliate public opinion. The Emperor of Russia published a proclamation. The Prince of Schwarzenberg, another, Blucher a third, and Vreda a fourth. General Bubna, on his part, issued proclamations through the medium of Colonel Simbachan and Count de Somas. Each of the inferior commanders followed this example. Never were so many pacific proclamations issued amidst the roaring of cannon. Never did so many sovereigns combine their efforts to excite the infidelity of subjects. But while the generals were making their harangues, the soldiers were pillaging and slaying without mercy. Their atrocities roused the utmost degree of resistance on the part of the country people. Prince Schwarzenberg found that it was no less necessary to intimidate than to subdue. He threatened to hang every French peasant who should be taken with arms in his hands, and announced his intention of burning every village that should offer resistance to the invaders. That which the enemy feared and forbade was precisely what was necessary to be done. Napoleon issued orders for the levy en masse of the eastern departments. General Berkheim was appointed to command his countrymen, the Alsatians. The people of Lorraine and the Franche-Comté evinced no less devotedness than the inhabitants of Alsace. Corps of partisans were organized in the Vosges and successfully opposed the enemy. On the banks of the Saône, the people of Burgundy manifested as much courage and confidence as though they had been supported by armies in their rear. The inhabitants of Chalon cut their bridge, and the Austrians, who were dispersed in Brest, were compelled to halt. Meanwhile, alarm spread in the valleys of the Alps. Bubna had intercepted the road of the Simplon. Valais was taken, and it was threatened that Savoy should be restored to the King of Sardinia. The Duke of Castiglione was appointed to organize the defensive measures in this quarter. He repaired to Lyon, whither the troops who had been hastily detached from the army of Catalonia and the depots of the Alps were also proceeding. General Desaix was taking measures for the security of Chambry, and General Marchand was organizing the levies en masse of Dauphiny. The enemy soon made such progress that it was deemed necessary for Napoleon to oppose him in person. Schwarzenberg had forced the passes of the Vosges, the engagement of Rambervillers, Saint-Dié, and Charmes had occasioned him to occasion some losses, but had not impeded his advance. His left wing was extended along the Saône, while his center advanced upon Langres, and his right was directed upon Nancy, which was the rendezvous assigned to the Prussians. Blucher soon appeared in Lorraine. York presented himself before Metz, and Sagten arrived at Nancy. The Allied sovereigns had been on the French territory since the 13th of January. Their headquarters followed the route of the Austrian army. The Duke of Ragusa, who had halted before the guns of Metz, finding himself too closely pressed, abandoned that bulwark of France to its own strength. General Duret had taken the command of the place, and General Rogna, one of our most skillful engineers, shut himself up in it. On the 14th of January, the Prince of the Moskva evacuated Nancy. On the 16th, the Duc de Treviso evacuated Langres, and on the 19th, the Duc de